And now let's talk with Stephen Shoemaker. Reverend Stephen Shoemaker, welcome to 30 Good Minutes.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here.
Your message conveys the unseen hand of God, even in our worst fears, our defeats, and most painfully changed plans. Must ask you how you personally have experienced that along the way on your own journey.
Well, I think we have a sense and a hope that God is in charge of everything. I think sometimes what we don't understand is that sometimes God's will is at work in a planning it over, not in just an intention, but God's improvising in the midst of our difficulties. I think for me, sometimes depressive episodes have been a time in which I have felt my life altered, but have seen God's unseen hand guiding, planning it over toward my highest good and hopefully the highest good of those around me.
Depressive moments?
I wanted to ask about
can you
that
just,
too. I've heard people
say
talk
more?
about that. I mean, how do you experience God in the midst of a depression?
What were those moments, if you can
Well,
share?
I think sometimes people go through seasons of depression in which they feel a kind of mental and emotional pain and feel a kind of hopelessness. But I think the resources of faith keep our eyes toward the future in such times as that.
Can you give us a sense as to the nature of the depression? Career, family, loss? What aspect of depression were you struggling with?
Well, I think that depression has many, many different kinds of etiologies or causes. I don't think usually it's just a single one. And many times the things you mentioned merge together in one kind of overwhelming sense of loss or darkness.
Or it's a chemical imbalance.
Or a
that
chemical imbalance.
makes all those things seem worse than they are. Harder
That's
to
right.
Get up. So you talked about the Joseph story and the way he got to grow and change. And it's a wonderful story because the brothers show up and they expect Joseph to be the same person he was when he was a kid, and he's become different. Do you think sometimes it's the family members who prevent us from being able to grow and change because they see us as being the same?
Well, I think it is interesting that he had to go away from home to do the changing. And I think also the hard circumstances of his life drove him deeper into a more profound place spiritually.
You talked about having to leave home in order to change, but we found out when talking to you earlier that you had gone to high school in Charlotte, North Carolina. And
That's right.
Now you're a famous preacher there at a well-known church. Is it strange to be back doing that in your hometown?
Well, it is an odd challenge to have your mother and your twin sister in your
Oh, my
congregation. They know you far better than you should be known as you try to preach. It has been an interesting, I think, challenge to go back to a hometown, and perhaps I needed to be 50 years old, before that happened, because the kind of maturing that you do and the growing that you do before you return to a home place.
Now, the sixth book, and your most recent, on being a Christian in an almost chosen nation, a reference from Abraham Lincoln. Say more about what that means.
Well, this is a wonderfully nuanced phrase of Abraham Lincoln. Both preachers and politicians wanted to assume too much about America being God's chosen people. And Lincoln used this wonderful phrase that we were God's almost chosen people. I think it gives us a kind of reverence that there is an unseen hand. There are the purposes of God being worked out, not only on a personal sphere, but a sphere of a nation, but that we can't presume upon where that unseen hand is moving or how we can be an instrument of God's unseen hand.
I can't help but think when you use the phrase unseen hand of God, that what you're really sharing with us is an unconditional assurance of hope, the hope that is still there when your worst fears have been realized. Is that part of it?
Well, that is, and hope that's not bound to the circumstances of this present hour, but is an overarching kind of care of God and guiding of God that keeps you focused on more than just the present circumstance.
Because most of us hear the phrase, God's hand is in, and you fill in the blank, but it's usually a positive outcome. God's hand was in the joy, or God's hand was in that gift of love that you receive. But you're using it in those moments, in those narrow places where we suffer and where pain comes, when plans change in
That's
a painful way.
I think that's very interesting that God's hand here is a different kind of hand than just as a parent in good times, but is there to guide us, to reshape us, to drive us deeper, to help us be more compassionate, to help our lives be more meaningful to the world around us in the midst of our darkest and altered lives.
Let's talk a little bit about this idea of America being an almost chosen nation. Do you think part of what Lincoln was getting at in that phrase was to give the idea that there could be more than one chosen nation, that we wouldn't be the only one?
I think certainly he was giving the impression that chosenness could be something more than one nation could claim. And I think Lincoln was saying that chosenness has both its responsibilities, inherent with that chosenness.
Could there be any nation that's not chosen?
You're asking me rather than Abraham Lincoln
Yes,
at this
I'm
point.
asking you. This is you, Steve.
I think nations need to live by a sense that they're living a purpose out for the welfare of both the well-being of their own citizens and the well-being of the world. And in that sense, I think every nation should aspire to have a kind of chosenness, not a chosenness as a kind of set-apartness of superiority, but a chosenness of a purpose to a greater good. I think what Lincoln emphasized was that there is a purpose guiding us, but we cannot presume upon that purpose. And I think it's easy sometimes to take our chosenness and presume upon it. And Lincoln warned us against that. I think it's also possible to give up any kind of notion that we could be used by the transcendent for a higher purpose. So in both of those dimensions, I think we have a lot to learn from President Lincoln.
I must just jump in here with the kind of gratitude I suspect many of our viewers may feel having heard your usage of inclusive language in your earlier message, referring to God with the pronoun she and her. How did that evolve for you personally? Where did you absorb that, and how do folks feel at the Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina?
Well, I think growing up with a lot of intelligent, highly spirited, as well as spiritual women had a lot to do that with both in the family and in my theological education. I think our church has a sense of God's transcendence that does transcend our own human kind of words for God. So I think there is, as Tillich would say, the God beyond God that we're all striving to meet. But they also recognize we've got to have a more generous set of names for God and descriptions for God in order to preserve the mystery of God. So I think we're getting more and more used to imaging God in feminine as well as masculine ways.
Well, I love the fact that you, in your remarks today, made God a waitress with a southern accent who brought you your coffee with extra cream and sugar. And I think, part of it is there's the mystery of God, but then we want something to cling on to. How do you, though, prevent that image from becoming the one that people always have for God?
Well, I think you talked very deliberately that mysteries preserved by multiplicity in terms of our descriptions of God and names for God, and that you consciously and conscientiously work on many descriptions of God so that one image does not become a graven image for God.
And so that all-embracing male, female, father, mother image has great meaning personally for you.
Yeah, it does, very much so.
Well, we're so happy you've shared that with us, and thank you. Thank you, Stephen Shoemaker.